Zoom events. Our Zoom events have been at different times in the day. It's been very nice to have a tool and a platform to use that allows access not only for you to watch, but also for our presenters to join us. And so we do plan in July to get back to our in-person programming, but never fear. They will be hybrid presentations. So we will also be presenting them live on Zoom. And so we are working right now with Layla Smallwood and Angie Vickers, who are both on board here for our event today. They are also on the East Tennessee Historical Society Education and Marketing and Digital Content staff. And so we will bring on July 7th, I believe it is, a talk on Methodism in the region, and particularly Church Street United Methodist Church's history and how it's experienced and is a testimony to that history and the changes that have taken place in the past, and in anticipation of where we are today and what we're doing in this world and the history we're creating. Dr. Dwight Wade will be presenting here at the History Center, but we will also be Zooming. And you will get more information about that. There will be registration involved for both in-person and virtual. But my name is Lisa Oakley. I'm Curator of Education here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. We are located in the History Center, just across from the Tennessee Theater in downtown Knoxville. So we do welcome you to come to the museum and visit us. We are open and we're getting back to our normal hours. You can find more information about us at easttnhistory.org. And we are also going to drop in the chat so that you can join and support all the great things we're doing, and also find out more about our upcoming events by being a member. You can join on that same website. And so the link is dropped into the chat box. So please check out our website with all we have to offer. And we're really looking forward to this next year as we go into 2020 with fresh new eyes and with all new programming for fall, and getting back in person, and hopefully hitting the ground for 2020 with some exciting new programs and revisions of some of our old programs, as well as bringing things into new scholarship and into new stories, and integrating some exciting new history into what we do at the Historical Society. Another event I want to mention to everyone is even coming up sooner than July. We have on June the 26th, that's a Saturday, we are going to be having a Zoom brunch brown bag. That's a little bit different time, but again, we're exploring some different opportunities to allow for more people to participate. On June 26th at 10:30 via Zoom, we will be joined by Carol Busey, Dr. Carol Busey from Gallatin, Tennessee. She is at Volunteer State, and she is our guest curator scholar for an online suffrage exhibit that we are developing, that we're looking forward to launching this summer. You know, so much of the celebration last year of the celebration of the centennial of the suffrage movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment, a lot of that had to be postponed because of COVID. So we're trying to regroup and it's 100 years plus one this year. So she is going to be doing a lecture on Suffrage Showdown, the Awakening of East Tennessee's Public Spirited Women. And again, that's going to be a Zoom brown bag on June the 26th at 10:30. And again, we're going to send out some promotional material. To register for any of that information and for any of those programs, or if you want more information, just email the email address that you register for this event through, eths@easttnhistory.org. So as you can tell, we have a lot of exciting things coming up, and we're doing new and different things and getting back in person. All of our brown bags and lectures this season are sponsored by the Albers Family Foundation in memory of Harriet Z. Albers, and through Gentry Griffey Funeral Home is also sponsoring our programming, and we appreciate them very much. And again, check out the link, find out about membership, and that's the best way to support what we're doing, but also to find out what we have as upcoming events. If you want to be added to our email list, and that's another great way to find out what we have going on, then also just send an email to that ETHS email address and ask to be added to our email list to get our notices. This is our largest registered for anyway brown bag as far as registrations. We had almost 80 folks register, which is for us at the Historical Society for our Zoom programs. That's something we're really excited about, and I'm sure that you all represent lots of different communities from all over, as well as our local, members and folks that usually come in the doors to see us for brown bags. So we welcome you all back. Those of y'all that have been participating in person, as well as we hope everybody will continue to be involved via Zoom with our virtual opportunities. For today, I'm going to be doing introductions here in just a second of our speakers, and they're going to tell you more about themselves and about their project. And that's what we're all here for, right? But I also wanted to say we're going to be doing questions and answer period at the close. And so in this Zoom world, the best thing to do, since everyone's mics are turned off, everyone's muted, all the video is turned off so that in the recording, we can control more of what's seen on the recording. So we will be glad to ask your question though. So if you will just include that in the chat box anytime during the presentation, if you have a question, just type it in the chat box and we'll be keeping an eye on that and make sure that we're able to present your question at the end. And if you have any other questions or any conversation that you want to, if you really appreciate something that, our guests today are working on, or you have a suggestion, or you have an idea, anything like that you would like to share with them, go ahead and include that in the chat, because that information they will receive through the recording. We'll make sure that they get the chat information as well. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce first, Antoine Fletcher. Antoine, for over 14 years, has been a devoted employee of the National Park Service. He has worked at parks such as Fort Sumter National Monument, Lyndon Baines Johnson National Historic Park, and now world-renowned Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He's contributed to the National Park Service through interpretation and education partnerships and currently science communication. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and currently resides in Asheville, North Carolina. So we're tickled that you're back in the neighborhood and we look forward to what you have to share with us. But before we get started with Antoine, and again, please pay close attention to their biographies, because as I was telling them earlier, we're just so appreciative of the work they're doing, and they bring such credentials and experience to this project. And it's really, I think we're very fortunate to have them in the neighborhood doing this work. Atalya Dorfield is serving as African-American Experience Research Intern with the park and with Antoine. And Atalya Dorfield is a Charlotte, North Carolina native who has a great interest in and love for Black diasporic cultures, histories, and art practices. After completing her undergraduate studies in English literature and art history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, Atalya went on to earn a BA in Black British Writing at Goldsmiths, University of London. With a professional background in the higher education and arts and culture fields, she is passionate about educating, sharing, and connecting communities with African American and other Black diasporic histories and cultures, while learning as much as she can along the way. In her free time, Atalya enjoys exploring museums, reading, and, like me, vintage shopping. We will have to talk about that later. Antoine, I'm going to let you get started. And thank you all so much for being with us today and sharing with us this great project.
Well, thank you. And on the behalf of the National Park Service, thank you for everyone being here today. I say a couple more words before I hand it over to Atalya for a second. I have been in the Park Service now 15 years, and I've worked at parks such as Russell Cave National Monument, where we're telling 10,000 years of history from paleo to Mississippian people. I've worked with the Eastern Band of Cherokee, telling the Trail of Tears story. I've also, worked at Waco Mammoth National Monument, where we're teaching people about Columbian mammoths, the largest mammoth that's ever been discovered in America. And then making my way to Fort Sumter where the Civil War was started. And now back at home in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I grew up in Northeast Alabama. My father was in the military. And, we moved around quite a bit, but I resided in Northeast Alabama for quite some time. And not only this history, but the history of the Smokies has always been intriguing to me. I've spent a lot of days rather in the creeks of the Smokies, the rivers, and the mountains. And this area, not just the Smokies, but Tennessee or East Tennessee and Western North Carolina is very close and dear to my heart. So I just want to thank you guys for having me. And before we get started, I'm going to hand it over to Atalya.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. As she said, I really love and appreciate Black and diasporic histories, literature, and cultures. That's always been something I've been really interested in. So growing up in Charlotte, you kind of learn about the different neighborhoods and histories locally. And when I went to UNC Charlotte, I really got interested in just learning about different West African cultures and kind of how that we see that reflected in African American culture and history now. So I'm just really appreciative of that history. And as she mentioned, I went on to study Black British literature. I got my master's in Black British writing at Goldsmiths University of London, where I got really interested in Black migration and travel and mobility. And it's really interesting how that has intersected with Black history in this region and Black Southern Appalachian culture, and thinking about the different people who have moved in and out of the Smokies and surrounding areas. And Southern Appalachian culture itself is I always say it's very niche. So I'm learning a lot and I'm really appreciative of the opportunity. So I can't wait to tell you guys a bit more about that. And again, travel and mobility is a really key part of this history. So I'm excited to talk more about that. And I'll pass it on to Antoine.
All right, I'm just going to share my screen. All right, Lisa, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, again, welcome everyone to the African American Experience Project of the Smokies, making the invisible visible. This project came about back in 2017. Park rangers in the Smokies really wanted to make the Smokies more well-rounded in its stories. We have so many great stories in the Smokies, but as we're putting those stories out to the public, we're missing this African American experience. And so in 2018, our superintendent, Cassius Cash, and the rest of the group started looking into, okay, how can we start researching this topic? It's a big topic, it's daunting, it's a huge task. We are looking at both, as you know, this park is in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. And with that, we're also looking at surrounding areas, and we're looking at things such as slavery. We're looking at also segregation. We're looking at Jim Crow laws. We're looking at oral histories. We're looking at Reconstruction, the Civil War. And so we are researching and looking into every bit of that history that is part of not only the Smokies, but the surrounding areas to hopefully one day be able to have a complete story. The thing is, when it comes to the Smokies, Okay. When it comes to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, most of us have been there before. It's beautiful, it's vast, it's 800 square miles between two states. And it was created in the 1930s. And we get about 12 or 13 million visitors a year. And within this park, we're very entrenched into the science, the salamanders, the hellbenders, the black bears that we have. But also, we have those human vestiges of history, such as the early white settlers, Eastern Band of Cherokee, and the African Americans that was there. And that's why this is a very important project. Um, we want to make sure that we are fitting into the National Park Service message to preserve and protect this history. And for Atalaya and I in the park, what we're looking to do is add value to our park. We don't want to discount any other stories. We want to make this park more well-rounded. And we're doing this through the African American Experience Project. Um, and so, you know, where does this take us? You know, where does this research take us? And so what I would like to do is kind of step back way in time and think about slavery and how we got and how it got to the mountains, and step back into the 16th century. And through Atalaya and I's research, we found out that there's two main points of African Americans being here or accounted for in the mountains. One of those is in the early 1540s when Hernando de Soto came through on his adventures and his conquests. And there is accounts of African Americans or enslaved people being with him and being left. Also, we have accounts of Sir Francis Drake with his attempts to colonize Roanoke Island, leaving about 200 slaves on that island of Virginia, which we still don't know exactly where those people went. But we do know that African Americans or Africans were here for hundreds of years. And in a lot of cases, what we're really looking at when we start thinking about African Americans making it to a place like the Smokies is when we think about slavery. And as you know, slavery began in Portugal in the 1400s. However, we really want to, Atalaya and I have been looking at, you know, how can we kind of find where these people were actually coming from during the transatlantic slave trade, a time where millions of Africans were brought over to America. And one thing that we've discovered is that, you know, there's a lot of Africans that came from West Africa or the coast in places such as Guinea to the Carolinas at the time in the 1600s. And so that kind of helps us not only know where some of these people came from, but also helps us understand their past a little bit more. And from there, we have to think about slavery in the mountains. And what I would like to do is really paint a picture for you guys as we move forward. First, when you think about the transatlantic slave trade, and you think about, you know, goods being moved from Europe, enslaved people being picked up in places such as West Africa, and then brought over here to a 4 month journey on the rough seas, compacted like sardines, and brought to this new land. The same lands that places like, you know, Sullivan's Island that we may visit for vacation today, downtown Charleston, New Orleans, Memphis, all these different places that were brought from, and just put yourself in their shoes, or it's hard to even try to think you're in this foreign land, away from family, away from friends. And once you do get here, if you do make it here with the family, then a lot of times you're torn apart. And the same as cattle, you're counted as chattel, and you're being sold into slavery just like livestock. And when you're at these major ports, you're brought from the major ports of Charleston, South Carolina, to walk or hike several hundred miles to get to the Smokies, which is even more different. If you think about seeing the Smokies for the first time in today's time, think about being an enslaved person seeing the Smokies for the first time hundreds of years ago. What we do want to tell you though is that the the mountain plantations and enslavement was a little bit different than a place like Charleston, South Carolina. In the mountains, as we know, it snows. There can be harsh weather. I mean, it can snow, easily, almost sometimes into the spring. And these plantations look much different. These plantations usually were much smaller. Um, Usually they had roughly about 12 enslaved people on these plantations in the mountains. Also, they were between 50 to 400 acres. Um, and the thing about it is they had more livestock than cash crops, such as tobacco and things such as that nature. Um, and what they would do, if you think about being enslaved on a mountain plantation, a lot of the times your jobs would have been to tend to that livestock, to even move that livestock to a place like Asheville. Um, and also, those growing seasons for those crops were a little bit shorter too. And so, enslaved people were loaned out to different places in Asheville, such as hotels and so on. And so that was a little bit different for slavery in the mountains. Now, what we've been doing is um, trying to find exactly, how many enslaved people were in counties such as Knox and Blount and Sevier, and Western North Carolina counties such as Jackson and Cherokee. Um, if you didn't know, in the 1850s, 60s is when enslaved people were starting to be counted for. We call these the slave schedules. Um, and what we've discovered from these slave schedules is that in these counties, roughly a county like Blount or Sevier would have about 80 slaves in that county on a couple of plantations. Now, in a place like Western North Carolina or Buncombe County, which holds a larger place such as Asheville, you may have about 1,200 enslaved people in that area. And so using the census records and these slave schedules really started our research and really helped us out. And so the mountains, by 1860, slavery is thriving. However, it's never like South Carolina because of things like white gold that can be, or rice that can be grown there. And however, in the 1860 period, we have the American Civil War that starts. And this is because of succession for different states, such as Tennessee and North Carolina leaving the Union. But before we dig deeper in that, way before the war even started, there was a culture war in Tennessee, Western North Carolina, as far as what we call the Smokies today. And this dates back to the Quakers of the 1700s and so on, with the abolitionist movements of East Tennessee. Although there was still slavery there and several slaves, and slavery is not good, there were people there that had an abolitionist movement during that time in East Tennessee. Where in Western North Carolina, there was incentives of land giving to slave owners and or just people for the more slaves that they had. And so there was already a culture war kind of happening around in East Tennessee. North Carolina had already figured out where they wanted to go when the American Civil War started. When the war started, you really have to look at Abraham Lincoln's Second Confiscation Militia Act. Before African Americans could serve in the war, Abraham Lincoln actually wrote this act in order to say that all people that can bear arms could actually serve in the war. He never said African Americans at the time were enslaved people, but the reason he put the Second Confiscation Militia Act together is because he was afraid of the Southern militias starting to have insurrections and take over. At that time, the rebuttal to that was the 22 slave law, which the Confederacy put together in 1862, which is where the Confederacy said, if you have a certain number of slaves, roughly 20, then you can actually stay on your plantation. So these slave owners could stay on the plantation instead of going to war. This is because in the mountains, there was a lot of talk about slave insurrections, a lot of talk about enslaved people running away. What are they going to do? Our life or well-being is going to change. And so during that time, the Confederacy made more laws to ensure that slavery stayed intact, while the not newly formed union, but the union at the time tried to make subtle changes to start bringing African Americans in the fold. And they would do this because they needed more white soldiers on the front line. At the beginning of this war, African Americans more served as cooks and cleaners, and also helped out with things such as barricades and moving arms and so on. We'll get into it as we go on. We'll get into when they actually started serving. So by 1864, things really changed. The war has drawn out a lot longer than they thought it would. Thousands of people are dying. And now things look a little bit different in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. When you look at a place like North Carolina, the east side of North Carolina has enslaved people that's finding the lines of the Union, while Western North Carolina is still heavily guarded by the Confederacy. When you look at Tennessee, places like Knoxville, the Knoxville area, different fortifications are being taken over by the Union. And in 1864, this is the first time that United States colored troops or African Americans would serve in the war. We have been doing our research about the Confederacy as well. We want to make sure that if we find resources for African Americans serving in the Confederacy, that we make sure that we tell people that story. However, so far, the research has shown that there were accounts of Union soldiers seeing African Americans with arms on the Confederate side, or seeing African Americans even on the front lines for the Confederacy. But as of now, in these two states, we haven't found where the Confederacy said, come on in, you guys can fight for us. And so we are still doing the research on that to make sure that is not a key to this project. As we move on, we talk a little bit about the findings of Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. And so we're still digging deep into Western North Carolina. A lot of the fighting happened in places like New Bern and things such as that, pretty far away. And a lot of the recruits that we know of that, went out to the front lines, came from Guilford or Buncombe County or Macon County. So we're still digging into that. However, when it comes to East Tennessee, in 1864, the first United States colored troops of the USCT was born. And they not only served in Knoxville, Tennessee, but they also made their way into Asheville, and they made their way through the countryside. And so you can only think of these, African Americans in these USCT uniforms working their way through the mountains. And there's been accounts of even previous slave owners at the time seeing these African Americans in uniform and being very disgruntled about it. So it caused a lot of not only fear, but a lot of disarray in the mountains when the USCT started fighting. Now, what we do know about the USCT is they were put there to ensure that there were more men in the Union Army. We are still looking. They did pose as cannoneers and so on. However, we have not found where they actually fired a cannon in a battle, in any battle in East Tennessee. So we're still looking for that. What we can tell, what is really good about, the USCT is on your right, you can see this mustard in row from a census record. And these mustard in rows tell us a lot. Before, in the slave schedules, you would have maybe the slave owner's name. You would have an enslaved person's name. Maybe they're a laborer or something that they do. However, when it came to the war, we started to know what these people were doing, how old they were, when they enlisted, also the color of their hair, their height, and even how they died and where they died. And so that changed tremendously. From this, before we move on, what we're doing now, after researching the findings of the American Civil War, what we're doing next is going into Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period is very important for the African American story because after the war, a lot of enlisted African Americans actually had to go in front of the court system in order to get their pensions. And so when they went in front of the court systems, they had to tell their story. They had to tell about their family, if they were married, if their family was in a different region or state, they had to tell how many kids they had. Stories of health, stories of safety, all of these stories were recorded after the American Civil War. It was the first time in history that we could learn a more in-depth story about an African American. So now we're starting to look into those pension records to learn more about the soldiers that was in the Smokies. And so we also our research took us to cemeteries, and cemeteries are very important to our culture, but it was definitely important to the culture of the Smokies. In the Smokies, we had 6 cemeteries within park boundaries that's enslaved cemeteries. We could have more. If you've ever been to the Smokies, there's quite a few cemeteries. You can go to any district on any side of the state and find them. However, we've been doing our research on these cemeteries, and what we found out so far is that there's several cemeteries such as the Enlow, which we're going to touch on a little bit more, Big Cove Road, Ravensford, which we just learned about last week, Higdon and Cataloochee in North Carolina, and then we have the Meigs Mountain Cemetery in Tennessee. And Meigs Mountain is close to Elkmont, if you've ever been, and close to Sugarlands. And so that's another cemetery that we're going to be doing more research on. But what we're going to look at when it comes to cemeteries are those cultural connections. We're also going to dig deeper into the Enlow Cemetery, and we're also going to talk a little bit about ground penetrating radar and the cadaver dogs that we've used in order to dig deeper into this project. But what was the cultural connections in the Smokies? And what I mean by cultural connections is how were white and black people connected when it came to cemeteries? Were they connected at all? In the Smokies, burials were different than other places. The Smokies back in the 1800s had burials that pretty much looked the same, whether you were black or white. And we'll get more in depth to that in a second, but you couldn't tell the difference unless someone really had a lot of money, which in the Smokies, that wasn't the case for most families. But I wanted to kind of share a little bit, go back to 1913 when Horace Kephart was in the park, and he is one of the leaders that got this park, that made it a national park, that identified the beauty and just the stories of it. And if you're ever in the park, you'll probably see Kephart Trail or something like that, or stream. That's Horace Kephart. And when he was in the Smokies, he actually looked at these burials and said, you know, the saddest spectacle in the mountains is the tiny burial ground without a headstone or headboard in it, all overgrown with weeds and perhaps unfit, with cattle grazing over the low mounds or sunken graves. Nothing more so mutely evident or of neglect. And so, as when you go into the Smokies and you see these graveyards, Horace Kephart, especially even back then, it's correct. Many of these grave sites, you wouldn't notice, you could trip right over them. They're deep in the woods or on nodes that you would have to hike up to. And that's no matter if it was a slave cemetery or if it was a white cemetery. But one grave site we really want to look at is the Enlow Cemetery. And the Enlow Cemetery is in the Atalya area in Western North Carolina. It's roughly about a mile from the Atalya Visitor Center. And if you know anything about the Smokies history, Abraham Enlow was one of the owners of the land. He also owned slaves in the early 1800s. The Enlow family was very prominent. He owned about 400 acres around the Atalya area. And we can tell from slave schedules that he did have several slaves and he sold slaves. And what I want to do is think about, you know, where we come up to these grave sites and look at the picture quite closely here. When we visit the Enlow slave site for the first time, you will see stones, you will see coins, sometimes shells, you will see small flags above ground. And what does that all mean? And what we've been doing is working with Western Carolina University to perform ground penetrating radar, but also we've also been working with the group to bring out cadaver dogs. And so, just move back, sorry about that. So what does that tell us? So first we have to look at how people were buried in the Smokies. So if you come upon one of these grave sites, what you're going to notice, just like Horace Kephart was saying, was these small stones deeply in the ground. You're going to notice these mounds. You're going to notice troughs around these mounds. And when we first started looking into cemeteries, the Enlow Cemetery was one that was very important to us because we had the slave schedules to back up the history, but also it had easy access to get to it. If you go over to Mingus Mill to see the mill, you won't even notice the enslaved cemetery is about roughly 100 yards away from the parking lot. Again, visible yet invisible. And you'll notice these characteristics of this grave site. And once you can indicate that it's a grave site, there's no way that you can, you know, exhume bodies from DNA. We don't want to do that. However, a lot of times, if you don't have slave schedules to know that this is an enslaved cemetery, a lot of the things that we know about is just primary sources or hearsay that's been handed down. So that can make it difficult as well. So we brought in Western Carolina University, and what they did was they used ground penetrating radar. And if you look at the left of the screen, you're going to notice exactly what I'm talking about, these grave sites. Uh, Even 6 months ago, before we performed ground penetrating radar for a second time, we thought we had 5 enslaved burials at this site. Because of ground penetrating radar, we've been able to find 8 burials at this site. 8 enslaved people that's buried at this site. Who are they? What did they do? How did they even get there? When did they live? We believe that this site, through census records, dates back to the 1860s for its last burial, uh, over 150 years ago. We also discovered that out of these 8 burials, there may be a couple of coffins at these sites. Now, in the mountains, people were either put in blankets, they were just put in shallow graves, or they could be put literally in a pine box or pine coffin. And if you look at the right of the screen, you're going to see these graves numbered from 1 to 8. And the dark or the lime green area that you're seeing is the actual area that we're looking to on the left. And also, what you will notice about this grave site is that these graves, or most graves in the Smokies, are facing east. They're on a knoll, high up, and they're facing east. And you're probably saying, well, some of you may know, but some of you may not. But that's because they're facing where they thought that God would come back. And so a lot of times when you see these grave sites, most graves are facing east for the second coming. Um, and also, with these grave sites, you'll see a couple of things that's left behind. We haven't found it technically in the Smokies, but we have had people currently leave things such as pennies, quarters, things such as that nature behind. That is an African tradition where in Africa it is believed that you have to pay a toll to get to the underworld and to get to the next life. And so this is a tradition that we've started seeing where people are leaving these items. Now, if we could go back to 1860, we might have seen cups, shells, we might have seen bent spoons, because those are the items that these enslaved people really adored. They used every day, and they bent them or they put holes in the cups because they wanted to make sure that other people wouldn't use them. And so right now we haven't found anything like that exactly here, but that would have been what it would have been like in 1860. Now, what you will notice if you ever visit enslaved graveyards is that these graveyards are usually away from public view, deep in the mountains. And the reason being is because back in slavery, enslaved people would bury their people far away from public view. They wanted to make sure they had time to grieve. And also, sometimes in the mountains, rather you're black or white, if you didn't have the land to be buried on, bury someone on, sometimes they would bury people on other people's land without them knowing. And so you never know, you may have a census record that says, hey, there's 6 slaves buried here. However, there may be more enslaved people that was buried there just because of this culture in the mountains. The other thing we've done is we've used cadaver dogs to help us find more burials in these mountains. And so we bring out cadaver dogs with the help of Western Carolina University. And those cadaver dogs can smell human decomposition that's 1,400 years old. And what they can do is they can actually distinguish between humans and animals. And we brought cadaver dogs out last week, and they actually hit on possibly more burials in this area. And so within the last 9 months, we went from 5 burials to 8 burials, and now possibly more. This is not the only cemetery that we have in the park. Um, this cemetery is only enslaved people. However, we do have cemeteries such as Meg's Mountain in Elkmont, where you have both Black and white people buried in the same cemetery. And so that's interesting to see. We also have the Hinton Cemetery on the western North Carolina Tennessee line, which just has a tombstone that says a Black man. This tombstone was recently put there by a group. However, this Black man was buried with white people. Another instance of this is in Cataloochee Valley, Little Cataloochee, where we have 2 enslaved people at the O.E. Kerr Cemetery, and then 1 burial of a possible white person. So you're also seeing people buried together in the mountains, which makes it even more puzzling. With that, we're going to move to our next slide, and we're going to talk about Southern Appalachian music. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Atalya. You should be able to take over the screen.
All right, let me see. All right, so we're going to go ahead and continue with, give me 1 second. With Southern Appalachian music. So when my first research project was African American Southern Appalachian music, which really from a wider scale gave me an understanding and provides a good understanding of what Southern Appalachian life and culture may have been like for enslaved Africans and African Americans moving forward in the Southern Appalachian Mountain regions. So with this research, I also started to get into railroad history and African Americans and what role they played in building the railroads. So we'll talk about that as well. And I'm going to sort of intertwine those 2 narratives, which will give a really good picture and understanding of how travel and migration and mobility played a role in these experiences, whether it was forced mobility or voluntary, and why people were moving in and out of the Smokies and surrounding areas. Again, with this particular aspect of the project, we were looking at a wider scale. So we looked at some regions that are a bit further outside of the Smokies, but still provide a good understanding of what some Black experiences may have been like. So starting with Southern Appalachian music, and beginning with instruments, one staple instrument that we think of when we think about Southern Appalachian Mountain music is the banjo, which arrived to what is now the Southern United States, or I should say was first spotted or documented in the 1740s and in the Caribbean in the 1600s. And we know that the banjo derived from over 16 long neck gourd instruments, including the encanting, ngoni, and the column. And over to the right here, you'll see an individual named Daniel Jetta in Gambia playing the encanting. And he did a really good NPR interview discussing that instrument and how the banjo is rooted in that instrument. So while my research has said that the banjo arrived as early as the 1740s, given that we know that enslaved Africans were moving about the Southern Appalachian region at least 2 centuries prior, I imagine that we could have seen the banjo a bit earlier in the region, but that is the first time that it's documented in time in what's now the US. And moving on to the fiddle, another staple mountain instrument in Southern Appalachia. So that has many cultural meanings. We see the fiddle or fiddle-like instruments in Native American cultures, different Middle Eastern cultures, as well as various West African and North African cultures as well. So we know that the fiddle has derived from many different regions in the world and has kind of combined and has taken on an intercultural aspect and characteristic in what we now understand as the fiddle. But the way that the fiddle is played in mountain music is very reflective of how fiddle-like instruments are played in West Africa, which has been described as a sort of soft scratching like manner, and the banjo as well. The downstroking way it's played in the mountains is reflective of the way enslaved Africans were playing banjos and long neck gourd instruments at the time. It's called the bear claw. And apparently it's really difficult to play downstroking banjo. So, but again, it's one of the staple ways that it's played in the mountains. Another thing that I looked at is the body as an instrument. So in 1739, there was a Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina when enslaved Africans escaped and were runaways and began to incite riots to move north to freedom. And they used drums to communicate with other enslaved Africans to join in. Um, yes, sorry. So they used drums to communicate with one another, and it ended in a really bloody battle between whites and the enslaved Africans at the time. And because of this, it's one of the hugest rebellions in history, slave rebellions in history. So because of this, there was a fear that enslaved Africans would continue to use drums to communicate with each other and to escape and to riot. So it became illegal in many parts of the South for enslaved Africans to use drums. And that was a staple in the music that they knew from back home in West Africa. So they began to use their bodies as instruments. This was called patent juba. And we see that now the way that Black sororities and fraternities use stepping. We see that in things like patty cake. So it's really lived on in what our practice is now, but they would use their bodies as an instrument to sort of contribute a padding-like or percussion-like quality to music. And the really interesting thing about music when we're thinking about the African-American experience is just as captured Africans' bodies were transported across the Atlantic in slave ships in these vessels, their bodies and their minds and their memories acted as vessels as well. So they took with them cultures and instruments like the nkanting and the goni and the column with them. And they used those things to survive in what's now the United States, in the Southern United States. And those things took on different meanings and characteristics. So we know that they used music as a way of storytelling and remembering their homelands. And they also used music as maps to freedom. So a lot of times there would be coded lyrics that gave instruction on how to escape to spaces where they would no longer be enslaved. In this image here, this painting in the center is called the Old Plantation, and it's based off of a scene in South Carolina. But I think it's a really good representation of musical culture and practices amongst enslaved people in the South. You'll see someone sitting with a banjo, and if you look really closely, there's religious carving on the banjo. You'll see the dancing here. Again, dancing took on a completely new meaning once drums and other instruments were banned, because they really had to find other ways to contribute to the music. So it's really something to think about as far as how instruments and how cultural practices traveled to the American South through slavery. And then we're moving on to enslaved people and the Western North Carolina Railroad. So there's a high demand for enslaved people to work the railroads. They began working on the railroads in the 1830s. Prior to this, there was a huge demand, especially in Western North Carolina, a lot of slave masters were sending their slaves to the West for gold mining, and they would come back with their findings. So shortly after that, we get into the railroads. So enslaved people were either hired out by their owners or rented and sometimes owned by railroads. It was not common for railroads to own enslaved people, but it did happen. So it's a really popular sentiment that enslaved men and women worked alongside whites on the railroads, and that there was some sort of, I would say, equal workload put on these people. But I would imagine, given the social dynamic, that things were different as far as the labor and who was doing the real grimy, dirty work in building these railroads. Enslaved men dug track beds and laid track. There are also stories of enslaved women doing the same thing. And we know that enslaved men and women also cooked and laundered in these spaces. So just thinking about that, and there's also where we start to see music advance even more, because there were different enslaved people were being transported from different regions in North Carolina to Western North Carolina to work on these railroads. So we start to see different musical practices being shared in this region as well. So, minstrelsy and Black Southern Appalachian music. So, just after the Civil War, we start to see is a continuation of Black people working on these railroads. And a lot of people are moving to regions like Western North Carolina to work the railroad for job opportunities. And we also see a lot of convict labor in the area. But this is also when music takes on a new turn in America and across the globe. So given the sort of the poor economic status of the South at the time, a lot of white men would go on and for performance and to make money, perform in blackface and put on minstrel shows, medicine shows where they would imitate what they perceived as Blackness. So this was a negative imagery, but it was really popular, and it was globalized through traveling minstrel shows. Um, and then it went on to theatrical events that were a bit more quote unquote posh, like vaudeville shows. Even Black actors, if they were allowed to act on stage and be paid for it, were required to perform in blackface. And blackface, just to go over that, is just a really dark black mask-like makeup put over the face, exaggerated red lips to mock African features. And so a lot of people in Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, and other parts of the South did not like the way that Black people were being portrayed in this imagery, and really wanted to step away from it. The banjo was used to further characterize these caricatures of Blackness. So we'll see as time goes on, a lot of Black people begin to neglect the banjo and Southern Appalachian music, given the role that it took on in these minstrel shows and the negative imagery that was popularized. And I have here Burt Williams and George Walker. Although they were not from the region, it is really important to think about. These were two very popular performers at the time. But the only reason they were able to be so popular as actors is because they would put on these minstrel shows, what white audiences wanted to see from Black people. And over to the left, you'll see The Banjo Lesson, a painting by Henry Ossawa Tanner, that's actually based off of what he saw as Black mountain life in Western North Carolina. And so he wanted to take the banjo and do something different with it and show it in a positive light. So he went on to paint this image based off of his sketches and the time that he spent in Highlands, North Carolina, to show the banjo as a more positive African-American symbol of cultural history. So this is just something to think about when we're thinking about why don't we see a lot of Black people in mountain music, Southern Appalachian music now? Why is that not popular? Or why do we think it's not popular in the African American community? And it has a large part to do with this minstrelsy and these vaudeville shows that were put on. And just one last thing on this slide, there was an enslaved man called Jim Spencer. He was formerly enslaved and he was a fiddler. And Hobart Smith, you guys might be familiar with him. He's a very popular Southern Appalachian musician. Recalled seeing him play the fiddle when he was younger. Again, we never hear this name Jim Spencer, but people know the name Hobart Smith. And Jim Spencer inspired Hobart Smith to get into fiddling and mountain music. So here again, we're seeing these roots in African-American culture and history that go ignored and invisible when we think about the overall genre of Southern Appalachian mountain music. So following the Civil War, the railroad was the most important industry that African-Americans worked in. Again, I've kind of already went over that, but Black railroad jobs were really prominent, again, in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee, and in different parts of Appalachia, where you start to see Black men and their families migrating from the Deep South into these regions for work. But another thing that we see is African-American men who are in prison being forced to work the railroads. So just thinking about slavery and the role that they played in the railroads, and then going into these convicts working the railroads, it was really poor conditions. A lot of people were in a way kidnapped and accused of these petty charges, trumped up charges, so that the North Carolina Railroad would have more people to work because they really needed to get the railroad built. Again, this is just after the Civil War, going into the late 19th, early 20th century, where the South is in a poor economic condition and is trying to rebuild during the Reconstruction era. Give me 1 second, I'm just trying to change to the next slide. And Antoine, do I still have, okay, here we go. All right, so sorry about that. So here you see a postcard image of stripes but no stars. And this circulated across the country, where you see, and it's sort of mocking these men, again, who were forced to work the railroads, convicts. Here it's an 1892 photograph that was circulated, where you see these Black men working the Western North Carolina Railroad in Asheville, North Carolina. And a lot of people talk about how impressive the Western North Carolina Railroad is. It's the way that a lot of people from different parts of the country were able to travel into Western North Carolina and experience spaces like the Smokies. So a lot of people marvel at it. And these are the men who built this railroad. And there were a lot of women as well who were in prison who built the railroad. A lot of people died of disease, injuries. A lot of people were guaranteed, if they did survive working on the railroad, to leave with permanent injuries after working the railroads. But again, thinking about invisibility, we never think about who contributed to how we experience space and the convenience of it. So Dan Pierce at the University of North Carolina at Asheville has been working on the Railroad Incarcerated Memorial Project that aims to highlight these convicts who built the railroad and many who lost their lives. And tying into our projects and what we have at the Smokies with the cemeteries, there are at least 139 unmarked graves along the tracks near Black Mountains and Swannanoa Grade. They were built in the 1870s by over 3,000 incarcerated individuals. And so again, thinking about slavery and tying in those connections, how people needed free labor and free Black labor to build the railroads, and that's what was found. So this is a really good project that I suggest that a lot of people look into. And again, just thinking about invisibility and bringing light to the names that we don't know. On this site, you'll see where they list the individuals who contributed to or worked on these railroads. And then we're going into Dave Thompson, where we see again this railroad and music narratives sort of collide. So Dave Thompson at one point was believed to be the only banjo player in Western North Carolina. And Cecilia Conway did this research in the 90s, and he was also a railroad worker in the 20th century. He traveled between Tennessee and Kentucky and Ashe County, North Carolina, working on railroads. Again, that's where you see a lot of that migration and mobility, where Black men were traveling for work to build these modes of transport throughout the country. And he comes from a family or a lineage of banjo players. So again, we're seeing that history of Black banjoing and Black Southern Appalachian music and contributions to the genre. And he's a possible inspiration to Tom Ashley. Again, through his travels and working on the railroad, he came into contact with many different people, and it's believed that he inspired Tom Ashley, another Southern Appalachian musician's work. But again, we don't know for sure, but it is believed that they came in contact and that Tom Ashley got to experience him in his banjo playing. And so then we're moving on into right around the Great Depression with the St. James Sessions in Knoxville, Tennessee, where we have Leola Manning and the Tennessee Chocolate Drops and other African-American musicians who were recorded during the St. James Sessions. So at this time, Southern music was very popular. However, hillbilly music was associated with Southern whiteness. So a lot of the Black pioneers who contributed to what we now think of as hillbilly music were not able to play or be recorded playing that type of music. It was more desirable to hear like the jazz, the blues, and gospel from these musicians. So we don't have a lot of recordings from people from these regions, from African Americans in the regions, but luckily we do have the St. James Sessions. So we have the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, who would sometimes change their name to the Tennessee Trio if they did desire to play music that was more quote unquote hillbilly. And we have Leola Manning, who sang gospel, and she considered blues improper, but if you ever get the chance to listen, her music did have a very bluesy sort of sound to it. So she had songs like Satan is Busy in Knoxville, Laying in the Graveyard, and The Blues is All Wrong. And then we have Knox Country Stomp and Vine Street Rag from the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. It's been recorded that when one of the members of the Tennessee Chocolate Drops the only reason they were able to hear their music is because they saw it in a jukebox. They never actually got to hear the music that they recorded unless they paid to hear it. So again, just thinking about how these musicians and their contributions to culture, they were really taken advantage of and didn't really get to reap any benefits from it. So again, just shedding light on these individuals and kind of getting some names from East Tennessee as well for the project. So then we're moving into more park specific history. And so it's 1931, just after the Great Depression, where we start to see the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, come into play. FDR went ahead on with this project to provide more jobs for young men after the Great Depression. And this is right around the time where Great Smoky Mountains National Park is being established as a national park. And here we start to see where race and segregation and conversations around race and how the park wanted to deal with that come into play. It's right in the start of its development. So here you'll see the superintendent at the time, Superintendent Eakin. It's a quote: "Local peace officers could not be expected to protect colored companies in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He advised against African-American CCC companies, and as far as we know, there were no African-American CCC companies to work in the park. We do know that African-American CC companies contributed to the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is very close to Great Smoky Mountains, but we never see any recorded histories or research that confirm or go against this idea that there were no African-American CCC companies in the park. And this speaks a lot to what was going on in the region. It's either this was a way for no African-American CCC companies to work in the park because they were not desired to work in the park, or it was true that the conditions, the cultural conditions in the area were not safe for them. So either way, we see where, for whatever reason, it was not desirable or understood as a safe space for African Americans at the time in the Great Smokies. And then we go on to African American park grounds. So the national park at this time did not want to have segregated parks. It was a really big conversation around what would be done for Southern parks. And it was established that parks in the South would have to abide by whatever the local laws were on segregation. So Great Smoky Mountains National Park is also trying to deal with how are they going to accommodate African Americans in the park. There was a very low visitorship of African Americans in the park during the earlier years. And even now, you don't see, we're still trying to build those numbers. The Smokies suggested that there be a designated campground or picnic area for Black people because it was stated that African Americans would not come to the park if there was no designated space for them, assuming for safety reasons. So while there was no designated space in the end, and there was also unfulfilled plans in the 1930s to designate an area in spaces like Ravensford or Cades Cove, even a space near Newfound Gap Highway, if anyone is familiar with the park at the time, we do see colored designated toilets at Newfound Gap and Forney Ridge in 1942. So while there was no specific segregated camp space or picnic area for African Americans at the park, we do know that there were segregated toilets. So again, just kind of speaking to the culture and the area at the time. And so then we're moving on to Job Corps in that went on from 1965 to 1966. It was modeled after the CCC, which ended in 1942, but unlike the CCC, it was not segregated. Job Corps recruited 16 to 24-year-old men and women and taught vocational skills. So we've been doing oral histories with Job Corps, people who did Job Corps at the time, African-American men. And right here in this image, you'll see Johnny Baker in the back, who we did an oral history with. And we've also done one with Frank Spann. And they both actually had really positive experiences in Job Corps and talk about how the Smokies is a bit of a soft spot, and the Smokies has a soft spot in their heart. That taught them a lot of vocational skills. They still keep in communication with one another. And when we asked them about the racial aspect and culture at the time, they say that they felt very safe in the Smokies. And there were no issues with race in the Smokies and in the park itself. But when they started to go outside of the park into other spaces, there was issues with discrimination, and there were certain spaces that they did not feel safe in East Tennessee. So again, we do see the park itself advance with Black people having opportunities and good experiences in the park. And we also see this narrative of travel and migration, because a lot of CCC workers were not from East Carolina and Western North Carolina. They signed up for the program in other spaces. Like Frank Spann, for instance, was from Charleston, South Carolina, and traveled to the Smokies for Job Corps. So continuing the stories. So again, we're looking at stories from within the Smokies and surrounding areas, and continuing to do things like oral histories, what we've been doing with Johnny Baker and Frank Spann, and other people in the area, to really sort of get these personalized stories of what has been going on and what was going on in the Smokies and surrounding spaces. Over to the right, you'll see this image of Shirley Carr Clowney, the author of Blacks in Blount County, Our Place in Time, Blacks in Blount County. And she's a historian herself in the area. So here we see a Black woman really giving this cultural and historical contribution to her hometown, to her space, a space that, again, does not often acknowledge Black history. So kind of just telling her own story. And that's what we're looking for, more stories from women. I don't know if you've noticed, but as the presentation goes on, we don't have a lot of women who we can tell their stories. So we're really looking into that. We're also doing town halls with presentations like this in the future, where we can share with the communities information about the project, and to also reach out and see if there's any information that anyone would like to share with us. Again, it's really hard to find these stories because African Americans in the area have gone, quote unquote, invisible for so long through scholarship and in history. And it's not a lot of recorded information. So we're really looking out to the community to share their stories. And I'm actually really excited because I've just learned about a really nice piece of history in Bryson City, North Carolina, that's going to really provide some nice shape to the project. So again, just looking out into different spaces, working with genealogy centers and historical centers to really help us paint a full picture, and also working on interpretation products as well for the project. And then just to think about with music, I mentioned before that when we think about Southern Appalachian mountain music, we don't think about African Americans, but we have people like the former members of the Carolina Chocolate Drops, Rhiannon Giddens and Don Flemings, who are shedding light on the Black pioneership of Southern Appalachian mountain music. I would suggest to everyone to kind of look into these individuals, into their older projects as a band, Carolina Chocolate Drops. And they really provide and shed light on good history of African Americans' involvement and contributions to Southern Appalachian music.
All right, all right. Well, thank you very much. That is the end of our presentation. And at this time, we can take questions. I know that Lisa's looking at the chat box, so we should go from there. Lisa, do you want to lead us, facilitate us?
And we've had some great conversation. A couple of folks shared in the chat box wanting to know how they can learn more, how they can help. And Angie was able to find the direct link to your page on the park's website. And I think that Atalya was also able to talk a little bit about some of the things y'all are going to be doing to engage in outreach. And the Historical Society is obviously excited about partnering in any way we can. And I'll put my video back on so that's not just the logo. So we do have some questions, and one of those was about the slave schedules. I think when you talk, and thank you so much about sharing and kind of deconstructing how you've done the research, because then people get ideas. Oh, this is something that I want to do. How can I do that? So I can just say someone was asking about how they might be able to access the slave schedules. I will just share from my perspective, if you can go anywhere where you can gain access to the 1860 census, then typically in that roll of film or somehow associated with it will be the 1860 slave schedule. It was done along with the census, and oftentimes whatever library, wherever you can access the census records, they will have an index. And you can also, it's just that it's kind of like that. We were talking about invisibility. Those records have been there. It's just that people haven't known to ask or haven't known they were available. So, and if you have any questions on how to do that or how to, check with here at the Historical Society or in the McClung Collection History Center, and we can help give you insight in how to use those resources. The other thing is if you are on Ancestry, if you have a subscription to ancestry.com, used to, it was very easy to select the slave schedules. Now it's harder to do that, but you can go in and search 1860 slave schedules, Sevier County or whatever. And there are different ways to get directly at those slave schedules. Or if you're looking for names of folks that owned enslaved peoples, then oftentimes the slave schedule will show up as an option for you to click on. So it is accessible, but again, sometimes if you're looking specifically for it, you have to search intentionally in Ancestry for it. So I will just share that. Anything else you would like to share as far as the slave schedules, how you all have accessed them and used them, or any other records for you to share with those that may want to do their own research on their own communities and spaces? Anything you can direct them to?
Yeah, no, Lisa, you covered it. That is exactly what we do in the park. We use ancestry.com, but also we have a wonderful archivist in our park that has tons of history. And like Lisa was saying, even in our park, we have so much history that it takes a while to dig through it. Luckily, our archivist is writing a book on African American history, and he has documents just ready to go. And so being a part of Ancestry.com is great, but also just like you said, Lisa, our local libraries and places, those places still exist. Please go out and check them out and support them because there's a lot of good stuff in there. The other thing is we've had a lot of, because of doing these type of town halls and presentations, we've had people from out of the woodwork say, hey, I have this information. And that's been very helpful. So do exactly what Lisa did to start and then work your way to the libraries. And you never know what you'll find.
And just look and ask, because it might be that no one's ever asked or looked before. And that's where we find these incredible stories. And I think we're all excited about adding complexity and interest and voices to our stories. So that was one question. Also, Jane mentioned, and you can go back, you might want to look at the chat because some folks have made some suggestions and they've also said, thank you for an incredible presentation. But Jane mentioned that she is working on, her DAR chapter is working on a enslaved cemetery, African-American cemetery in Von Orr, the Solomon's Temple Cemetery. And one of the things that I wanted to share is we have done a lot of work with students and with schools in Monroe County, particularly along the Cherokee Forest Range there, as well as on up into Blount County and the Von Orr area. And one of the things is, if you know stories in those areas, please share them forward, because so many people moved out of the park or moved with the rail companies or whatever to different areas. So it may be that there are family connections, especially in these very tight communities, of families, African-American families, that may have moved out of the park area into these other counties. So thank you, Jane, for mentioning that. And I would just mention that, you may think that you don't have an association with the Smokies in your own home community, but yeah, people, like you were talking about, movement and transitions of people. Yes. So actually, a lot of the questions had to do with sources and that sort of thing, or how they can become involved. I do have a question for you about the Enlow Cemetery. Is there an Enlow White Cemetery that is adjacent to, or is it fairly close? How are those in the landscape? How are they relative?
Correct. Yes, there is an Enlow cemetery with the family buried there. That's pretty close. I have not got to visit it yet. I actually started my job during COVID, and so I
Wow.
have just yeah. So for the people out there, I've just started really going into the park and
Yeah.
seeing these places, and so that is on our list as well. But yes, there is one in that Akana Lefty area for the family.
It'll be great to see the landscape and how it relates.
Mhm.
And you can imagine it'd be nice to know, what did it look like? Was it a cleared space? What were the sight lines? How did those spaces interact? Or, how
Yeah.
did the family and the community engage? And that's, I'm thankful for the conservation of the park, but sometimes it'll be interesting to see what you can discover there.
I will also add to that. Sorry for interrupting, but we're also trying to find out. We had trails crews come in, such as the JCC, CCC in the 60s and 30s and things like that, and did when some of those trails crews, even 20 years ago, while they were trying to upkeep these cemeteries, did anything change? Did they see a mound of dirt that was moved over, and did they make a mound? What? And so we've been trying to trace down that information as well. So whether we're doing oral histories or even in the park, trying to figure out, okay, we want to make sure that this is what it looked like when the park was established in the 1930s.
Yes.
And so we're working on that right now, just to be sure that it has not, changed since that time.
And I want to draw your attention. Thank you, Angela, for sharing with me a question. And I'm looking forward for the opportunity for you all to meet and talk with Angela Dennis, who does great work for the Knott Sentinel and Black and Appalachia. And hopefully you all can find ways to partner with that incredible group as well, that's doing wonderful work in the region. So perhaps there is a way, an email or a contact other than just going to the website. So perhaps you can put in the chat box, or want to share with folks how they can directly, talk with you. This has obviously gotten a lot of interest.
Sure. If you go to the website, when it says email us on the African American Experience Project page, that email goes right to me. So yeah, but I'm also, Atalya and I can also add our emails to the chat. Just one small thing for the group. Sometimes those emails will go to a junk email because I have a government email. So if I don't respond back in a timely manner, it's not that I don't want to, it's that I didn't see it. So follow up if I don't respond in a week or so, because some of those emails go to my junk email.
Yeah. And someone does have a question about, why isn't Ancestry free? And I've asked that for a long time, talking about the company, the website. And it is free if you are, like if you're in Knox County and you have a Knox County library card, then you have access, as well as you can use in many libraries. They have that database that you can utilize free. If you are an educator in a Tennessee school through the Tennessee State Library and Archives and TEL, you can get access for your classroom, and as a teacher, you can get access. So just work it a little bit, communicate with us if you have other ideas. But unfortunately, as far as individual use of Ancestry, it's hard. But they do have a trial. So get all your research in line and use your trial 30 days. And then, but the one thing about Ancestry is, if you call them, a person answers. And so they will talk to you and perhaps help you find a way to work around that. I know that this has been an incredible opportunity to visit. I know you all have something you need to get to. I thank you for adjusting your schedules. I'm going to ask Angie or Layla to see if there's anything that I have missed. Again, there were lots of thanks, lots of suggestions. We have people sharing information with you all. But I think, and the one thing I want to just conclude with is, LA was talking about the importance of spaces. And I like using that term because so many times we get all caught up in political definitions of this person's responsibility or this person's responsibility or, boundary lines or whatever. The reality is we're all in this space today. So we need to look in our space and the spaces around us and see what good work we can do there, because we all can make an impact and we can all do the research and we can all ask a question and we can all listen to a voice. And so thank you all for sharing your good work in that, and think about your space and think about the spaces that you can touch and impact in one step away, and see what good work we can do. So anything else from anybody?
Yeah, I would just like to add a couple of things. Please keep, revisiting our website. Our job, LA and our job, 2020, 223, we're starting to really look in making more tangible things for people to see. So, we're talking about a wayside panel project in the park, which is 50, 60 new panels, and these African American experience panels will be at different cemeteries and places like Elkmont, where African Americans prepared the homes for the Knoxville citizens before they came in the summer. So that's something we're looking into. And so please keep going back to the website to see, updates and things like that. The other thing to that we're really kind of digging deep in, what we're trying to do is really create an experience that links to Blue Ridge, Asheville, Knoxville, almost such like a trail. And we have the technology to create something called story maps. And these are digital maps, what locations that people can visit on their own. And so hopefully next year we can create that map, and when you're visiting the park, you can say, I just want to visit the cemeteries, and you will have the coordinates to do that. You can program them in your car. You can look before you come on the website. The other thing that we're really looking into is hopefully we have put in a grant proposal or a project proposal for an African American music, show out at in Atalya. Hopefully, we'll get the money from Washington, but we want to make sure that we're commemorating this project through music as well. And so we should know if we receive that money by next year, we hope. And so that's something to be on the lookout for. And the last thing is, if you miss, we're going to be doing a lot of town halls with Western Carolina University, UNC Asheville. We reached out to UT Knoxville and so on. And so we're going to start those in the fall. If you visit our website starting September 1, you're going to start seeing those town halls pop up on our website, and they'll be hosted by the universities, and we will have more information. Like I said, we are deeply looking into, reconstruction and segregation now. And so this story will be totally different by the time we get to our town halls. And we're also putting together, hopefully, a traveling exhibit in the next couple of months. And so hopefully that traveling exhibit can come to a place near you. What I want to leave with before I leave it to Atalya is that I've done a lot of research projects such as this one with the Cherokee and with African Americans in Charleston. this one is a really important one. It's, you know, in Charleston, I could find just so many amounts of history and these primary sources. Here, not so much. And so, you know, this one is really special because we do need your help. We need everyone's help. This is a community effort, not just a National Park Service effort. So thank you very much for being here today. And I look forward to working with all of you in the future. Atalya, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I definitely echo what you said. We need the community's help with research, for sure. Not even research, just like if you have any personal stories or sometimes even when I'm looking online, I know that through familial history, people will have these stories that they're able to share. So anytime you come across anything or if you have something to share, please reach out to us. And I thank you so much for just coming in and listening. And if you ever want any more information or have any questions, we have our emails in the chat. Reach out to us. And it's really been a pleasure to be able to speak with you all.
And same for us. And thank you all so much. Thank you for everyone joining us. I think we could just keep talking forever, but I know we have things to do. Thank you for spending your time with us. I hope you're able to join us for our upcoming events, and just email eths@easttnhistory.org to get on our email list, or look at the chat, click on that link. I'll give you a second to click on about joining, or just at least to get into our Historical Society website. Thank you again so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day.